Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be, really diving deep into macroeconomic policies and how they function differently in developed countries versus developing countries. And we have a lot of really interesting research for this deep dive, including work from Kaminsky, Reinhardt, and Vey, and as well as some perspectives from experts like Gita Gopinath and Roberto Rigoban.
Yeah, it's an area that I think is really fascinating but often gets oversimplified. The assumption that these policies work the same way everywhere just doesn't hold up.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess one example of that I've always found a little bit puzzling is this idea of procyclical capital flows. Right, this idea that both developed and developing nations see more capital flowing in during economic booms and less during recessions. Now, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but as someone who's familiar with this area, is this as counterintuitive as it seems? Wouldn't you expect more capital to kind of flow in when things are tough and support is needed?
Yeah, it's a very common misconception. You'd think that kind of counter-cyclical flow would make things more stable, but the reality is that investors often chase momentum. They see an economy that's doing well and they jump in, which just fuels the boom even more. And then at the first sign of trouble, everyone kind of pulls back, making the downturn even worse.
So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, driven by investor behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And this is especially true in, I guess you could say, middle high income countries. These are economies like emerging markets that are often seen as riskier investments. So, their access to capital is much more volatile. In fact, the Kaminsky paper that we have highlights this with some pretty striking data. During economic downturns, these countries can actually experience a drop in capital inflows of about 1.4% of GDP, which is pretty significant when you think about it.
Yeah, 1.4% of GDA. Wow. That's a lot of investment disappearing, right when you need it most. So capital flows can definitely worsen those cycles. What about the role of government policies, specifically when we talk about fiscal policy, things like government spending and taxation? Do we see a difference there in how developed and developing countries approach this?
Absolutely. Developed countries, they tend to employ fiscal policies that are either countercyclical or acyclical. So they're either actively trying to smooth out that economic cycle or at least avoid making things worse. During downturns, they might increase spending or cut taxes to try to stimulate the economy, and then, tighten up when things are going well to kind of prevent overheating. But developing countries often have a very different picture.
Different how? The research that you gave me kind of hints at this idea that developing countries are more pro-cyclical with their fiscal policies. But, how strong is that effect in reality?
It's a very strong effect. Developing countries often demonstrate a really strong pro-cyclical fiscal policy. They'll actually spend more when times are good and then have to make really sharp cuts when the economy weakens. It's a pattern that creates a lot of volatility.
Yeah, that's surprising, to be honest. I mean, I knew there was a difference, but I didn't realize it was that pronounced. Does the research give any specific examples that really illustrate this contrast?
Yeah, there are a few. Kaminsky's research actually includes a table, Table 9, that kind of shows the percentage change in government spending during good times versus bad times. Liberia, for example, really stands out as kind of this extreme example of procyclicality. Their government spending actually jumps by, get this, 32.4 percentage points more during good times compared to bad times.
Wow, that's huge. 32.4%.
Yeah. It's a big difference. And then on the flip side, you have a country like Sudan. They actually decreased government spending by over 7 percentage points during those boom periods. So they're actually demonstrating that countercyclical approach.
Wow, so you have Liberia increasing by over 30% and Sudan cutting by 7% during the same, basically, economic conditions. That's a huge range. Why is this pattern so common in developing countries? Is it just a case of bad policy choices?
It's actually more nuanced than that. A key factor is really access to funding. When times are good, capital's flowing in, it's easy for governments to borrow and spend. But when a recession hits, that capital dries up and they're suddenly forced to make these deep cuts. That lack of consistent, stable funding sources really contributes to this pattern.
So it's almost like they're more vulnerable to these swings because they don't have the same access to stable funding.
Exactly.
Interesting. So what are some of the other factors? Because I imagine it's not just funding, right? There's got to be other things that are kind of contributing to this pattern.
Yeah, the political economy plays a big role as well. During booms, there's often a lot of pressure on governments to spend on, popular projects, even if it's not really fiscally responsible in the long term. And then when a downturn hits, it can be politically very difficult to either raise taxes or implement spending cuts that might actually help soften the blow.
Yeah, I can see that. And, I've heard you mention before this idea of the inflation tax. I'm curious, how does that play into all of this? Because, to be honest, I think it's a concept that I always struggle to fully grasp.
Sure. Well, the inflation tax is essentially a way that governments can leverage inflation to, in effect, reduce their debt burden. As inflation rises, the real value of their existing debt actually decreases. So they're essentially repaying their debt with, I guess you could say, cheaper money.
I see. So it's a way to manage debt through inflation instead of through traditional fiscal measures?
Exactly.
How does this play out differently in, developed versus developing countries?
Well, developing countries tend to rely more heavily on this inflation tax during economic downturns, so it becomes more of a kind of last resort when those traditional funding sources dry up, and this makes their approach more procyclical. Developed countries, however, tend to use this tool less during bad times. Their approach to managing inflation is usually more countercyclical.
Okay, so once again, we see this theme of developing countries kind of resorting to these riskier, less conventional methods because of those limitations in stable funding.
Yeah, it's a very difficult cycle to break free from.
Okay, so we've talked about capital flows, fiscal policies, and this, very interesting concept of the inflation tax. Let's move on to monetary policy. How do things like interest rates and credit growth factor into all of this? I know this is a complex area, but is there kind of a simplified way to understand the general trends here?
Yeah, well, monetary policy is definitely a complex area, especially when you start to factor in different exchange rate regimes. But some evidence suggests that developing countries might be more pro-cyclical here as well. For example, nominal interest rates often rise during recessions in developing countries, which seems a little counterintuitive, right? You'd normally expect them to lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and stimulate the economy.
Yeah, that does seem like the opposite of what you'd expect. Why would they raise rates during a recession? Is there any logic to that, or is that just bad policy?
Well, it's often tied to efforts to stabilize their currency. When a country's economy is struggling, its currency typically weakens, and raising interest rates can actually make holding that currency more appealing to foreign investors, which can help to support its value.
I see. So it's almost like they're trying to address one problem, which is this weakening currency, but potentially creating another problem by making borrowing more expensive within the country.
Exactly, and this is part of what the researchers refer to as the when it rains, it pours phenomenon. In developing countries, the capital flow cycle and the macroeconomic policy cycle, they often reinforce each other in a way that creates this kind of amplified effect.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Can you maybe elaborate on what you mean by that? I know we've kind of touched on this idea before, but how does this play out specifically with monetary policy?
Okay, so during good times, right, when capital is flowing in, governments are already increasing spending, which can sometimes lead to economic overheating. And this makes them much more vulnerable when that inevitable downturn hits. And then when the downturn does occur, capital dries up, they're forced to cut spending, and they might even raise interest rates to try to stabilize their currency. And all of this together really deepens the recession.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult to manage. Is this simply a consequence of poor policymaking in these countries? Are they just making bad choices?
Well, it's not always that straightforward. Roberto Rigobon, in his commentary on the Kaminsky paper, he actually brings up this idea of what's called the simultaneous equation problem. He basically argues that even if a developing country had, in theory, countercyclical policies in place, if its economy is constantly being hit by shocks that are kind of pushing spending and output in the same direction, it's going to look procyclical regardless of the intentions behind the policies.
That's fascinating. So you're saying that it's not necessarily bad intentions, but rather the types of economic shocks that these countries are facing that can make them look pro-cyclical, even if their policies are on paper, designed to be a countercyclical.
Exactly. And the nature of these shocks does differ between developed and developing countries. Developing countries are often hit with what are called more volatile trend shocks. These are big structural shifts in their economies. Whereas developed countries, they tend to have more stable trends with smaller fluctuations.
Can you give me an example of what a trend shock might look like? Like what kind of shock would disproportionately impact a developing economy?
Well, think about commodity prices. Many developing economies are heavily reliant on exporting raw materials. A sudden drop in, the price of their primary export commodity, that can send their entire economy into a tailspin. And that creates a massive shock that's really difficult to manage with traditional policy tools.
Right, because it's such a fundamental shift in their sort of income stream.
Exactly.
So these dramatic shifts are more common in developing countries, which makes it much harder for them to maintain those countercyclical policies, even if they wanted to.
Precisely. And this feeds into that when it rains, it pours a phenomenon that we talked about earlier. When a developing country hits this period of rapid growth, it often feels like a new lasting trend. So everyone jumps in, investors, governments, everyday people, they all start spending more, borrowing more, and the boom just intensifies. But when a downturn hits, it's equally dramatic. Investors pull out, governments have to make these drastic cuts, consumers retrench, and it just creates this downward spiral.
That paints a pretty bleak picture. Are we basically saying that pro-cyclical policies are just inevitable in developing countries? Is there anything they can do to break this cycle?
It's definitely a challenging situation, but I wouldn't say it's inevitable. While these volatile economic shocks are a major factor, developing countries can still strive for more countercyclical policies.
Okay, so there's some hope. What are some of the ways they can do that? How can they work towards more of those countercyclical approaches?
Well, building strong institutions is absolutely crucial. We're talking about institutions like independent central banks that are shielded from political pressure, transparent budget processes, clear fiscal rules that limit spending during those boom periods. These kinds of institutions can really help create a more stable and predictable policy environment, which in turn kind of encourages that countercyclical behavior.
So it's not just about having the right policies in theory, it's about having the right systems in place to actually make those policies a reality, even when faced with those economic and political pressures.
Exactly.
Okay, and I know there's a whole world of research out there exploring specific policy solutions that can help developing countries kind of move away from this pro-cyclical trap and towards more stable and sustainable economic models. And that sounds like a perfect topic for us to kind of explore further in our next deep dive. But for now, I think we've covered a lot of ground. What do you think are the key takeaways from this first part of our conversation?
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway is that we really need to move beyond this kind of simplistic notion that macroeconomic policies work the same way everywhere. The realities in developing countries are much more complex, and understanding those complexities is really the first step towards finding effective solutions.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We can't just assume that what works in a developed country will automatically work in a developing country. The context is different, the challenges are different, and the solutions need to be tailored to those specific circumstances.
Exactly.
And, I think another really important takeaway is that this isn't just an academic debate. These pro-cyclical policies have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely.
And I think our discussion today has done a really good job of highlighting both the challenges and, some of the potential solutions that are out there. It's a complex issue, but it's one that, I think we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Well, I'm eager to continue this conversation and, delve a little deeper into some of those potential solutions. But for now, we'll pause here. Listeners, we encourage you to take some time to, think about this information and maybe even think about what the implications of these pro-cyclical patterns might be in the real world.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into this fascinating topic. Until then, thanks for listening. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our, exploration of macroeconomic policies in developed versus developing countries. And before the break, we were talking about those volatile trend shocks that can hit these developing economies. And I'm curious, do these economic booms, do they feel different in a developing country, like compared to a developed country, given those, the context of these shocks?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and the answer is they often do. When a developed country experiences, a period of growth, it's usually seen as a continuation of an existing trend, maybe with a bit of, extra momentum. But when a developing country hits a growth spurt, it can feel like a completely new era has begun.
So it's not just the rate of growth, but the overall feeling surrounding it that kind of shifts.
Exactly. There's often a sense of euphoria, this belief that this is like a fundamental change that's going to lift the country out of poverty, maybe even propel it onto the world stage. And that feeling can be incredibly contagious.
So everyone gets caught up in this excitement, the investors, the governments, everyday people, they all start behaving differently.
Precisely. You see investors pouring money in, hoping to get in on the ground floor of the next big thing. Governments, they're ramping up spending, launching these big infrastructure projects, expanding social programs, maybe even throwing in a few tax cuts just for good measure.
And people are probably, they're feeling pretty good too, right? They're seeing their incomes are going up, their lives are improving. So they probably start spending more, borrowing more, which just fuels the boom even further.
That's exactly the cycle. And on the surface, it all seems to make sense. Everyone is optimistic. Everyone is acting rationally based on the information they have. But the problem is these trend shocks, they can be much more fragile than they appear.
So what happens when the momentum inevitably stops? and that growth spurt kind of comes to an end.
That's when the when it rains it pours phenomenon we talked about earlier really kicks in, right? You see capital flows reverse, government spending collapses, and the economy contracts, often much more sharply than a developed country that's facing a similar downturn.
Because that initial boom was built on this, less stable foundation.
Exactly. And this is where the real danger lies. These boom bust cycles, they can be incredibly damaging both economically and socially. They can erode trust in institutions. They can even lead to political instability and often leave the country worse off than it was before the boom even began.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's a way to achieve economic growth without that kind of volatility built in.
That's a great question, and one that economists are, still working to answer. There's no easy solutions, but understanding the dynamics at play is definitely a critical first step.
So we've talked about, how these different types of economic shocks can lead to these procyclical policies. What are some of the other factors that might be contributing to this? Is it all about external forces, or are there internal factors within these developing countries that are also playing a role?
It's a combination of both, really. We've touched on some of the internal factors already, like weak institutions, political pressures that make those countercyclical policies difficult to implement, and that reliance on the inflation tax. But, there are a few others that I think are particularly relevant.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to, go a little deeper on that. What else is kind of going on beneath the surface?
One factor that comes up a lot in the research is this idea of fiscal procyclicality bias. It basically means that there's a systemic tendency for governments to spend more during good times and less during bad times. And this bias can exist even in countries with, relatively strong institutions.
Why is that? I mean, you'd think, like, if the goal is to be countercyclical, why is this bias so prevalent?
There are a few explanations. One is, simply human nature. When times are good, everyone feels more optimistic, maybe even generous governments included. They're more likely to approve new spending programs, give out raises, implement those tax cuts. But then when a recession hits, the opposite happens. Everyone kind of tightens their belt. Governments are forced to make cuts, and those cuts often come too late and end up being too deep, which, can actually make the recession worse.
Right. It's like they're oversteering in both directions. Too much spending in the boom and then too much cutting during the bust. Is there anything beyond just human nature that kind of contributes to this bias?
Yeah, the structure of government budgets in many developing countries also plays a role. A large portion of their revenue often comes from, natural resources or other kind of volatile sources. So when commodity prices are high, their coffers are overflowing, it's tempting to just spend freely. But then when prices crash, revenue plummets and they have little choice but to make those really drastic cuts.
So their income is already fluctuating, which makes it even harder to manage, their spending in that countercyclical way.
Exactly. And to make things even more challenging, many developing countries also have very high levels of debt, which further limits their flexibility during those downturns. They're forced to use a large portion of their already kind of limited revenue just to service that debt, which leaves even less available for essential spending. It's a really tough situation.
Yeah. Okay. So we have these external factors like those volatile trend shocks, and then we have internal factors like this, fiscal procyclicality bias, high debt levels. Anything else that's kind of contributing to this pattern, or have we covered the major drivers?
Well, there's one more really cruel element I think we need to talk about, and that's the role of political incentives.
Okay. And knowing how politics often work, I have a feeling this might not be a positive factor. So how do political incentives kind of impact this whole tendency towards these pro-cyclical policies?
Well, in many developing countries, there's a strong incentive for politicians to kind of prioritize those short-term gains, even if it means compromising, long-term stability.
Why would they prioritize the short term if it risks causing long-term harm?
There are a few reasons. One is just the nature of electoral cycles. In countries with frequent elections, politicians are often more focused on, getting reelected than they are on making, sound economic decisions that might not deliver results until after the next election. So this can lead to, this focus on spending money, cutting taxes during those boom times to boost their popularity, even if it leaves the country much more vulnerable to a future downturn.
Right. So it's that classic kind of short-term political thinking overriding, those long-term economic plans.
Exactly. And this short-term focus can be, even further intensified by political instability. In countries with a history of, maybe coups or revolutions or other types of disruptions, politicians often feel like they need to kind of grab what they can while they can because they might not be in power for very long.
So it's almost like a survival instinct in a way, secure your own position first, even if it potentially harms the country's, long-term economic health.
It's a cynical perspective, but it's, often the reality. And the short-term focus can have a really profound impact on macroeconomic policies. It can lead to reckless spending, unsustainable debt levels, and a real failure to invest in those, really essential public goods like education, healthcare infrastructure.
Yeah, that paints a pretty bleak picture. Are there any developing countries that have kind of managed to, break free from this pattern and successfully implement those, more sustainable, more long-term approaches?
There are definitely some success stories out there. Chile is often cited as an example of a country that's made, really significant progress in implementing countercyclical policies.
That's encouraging to hear. What did they do differently? What allowed them to kind of make that shift?
One key factor was the creation of, really strong fiscal institutions. Most notably, they have this independent fiscal council that basically provides an objective analysis of, the government's budget proposals. So they essentially brought in these, external experts to offer unbiased assessments and, really ensure a degree of accountability.
So they built in a system to kind of help them, resist those political pressures and that short-term thinking we talked about before.
Exactly. And that council has played a key role in, ensuring that the government is saving money during those boom periods and, spending wisely during those downturns. So really helping to smooth out those cycles.
Are there other good examples of countries that have kind of successfully implemented these countercyclical measures?
Yeah, Botswana is another really great example. They've managed to avoid those boom bust cycles that have plagued so many other, resource-rich countries. And they've done this by, very carefully managing their diamond revenues, investing heavily in diversification to build a more resilient economic base.
So they didn't fall into that trap of just, spending all their resource wealth as soon as it came in. They really took a long-term approach.
Yeah, exactly. They used, a significant portion of their revenue to fund education, healthcare infrastructure, which, really helped to create a much more diversified and resilient economy that's less vulnerable to those volatile swings.
Yeah, those are some inspiring examples. It sounds like, breaking free from this kind of pro-cyclical trap, it is possible, but it takes, strong leadership, it takes robust institutions, and it takes a real willingness to make those tough choices that prioritize, the long-term health of the country over those short-term political gains.
You summed it up perfectly. And it's important to remember that, these reforms, they don't happen overnight. It really requires time, effort, and a sustained commitment to change.
I'm feeling a bit more optimistic, knowing that it can be done. So, we've talked about, all the different factors that are contributing to these pro-cyclical policies, but I think it's also important to talk about, the consequences. What are the real-world impacts of these boom-bust cycles? How do they actually affect people's lives?
The consequences can be really profound. They affect virtually every aspect of society.
Yeah. Let's break it down a bit. What are some of the most, significant consequences when it comes to the economy itself?
Well, one of the most obvious is just increased volatility. These boom bust cycles create a much more, unpredictable economic environment, which makes it really difficult for businesses to plan for the future and for, individuals to make, those sound financial decisions. This volatility can also lead to things like, higher inflation, currency fluctuations, and even, in some cases, financial crises.
Right. So it's not just like an economic theory. It creates real instability and risk in people's lives. What about the social impacts? How do these cycles kind of affect, people's lives beyond just those economic factors?
Well, the social impacts can be just as devastating. During those boom periods, inequality often widens, as the benefits of that growth tend to flow to a small elite, while, the majority sees little improvement in their living standards. And then when the bust hits, the poorest and most vulnerable are often hit the hardest. They're the ones who lose their jobs first. They're the ones who can't afford basic necessities. They're the ones who are most at risk of falling into poverty. And it can become this really vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, really. It sounds like these boom-bust cycles kind of create a system where, the most vulnerable are repeatedly being left behind, while a small segment benefits disproportionately.
That's unfortunately often the case. And these cycles can have, really long-term negative consequences. They can lead to social unrest, political instability, and a decline in, overall human development. It's crucial to remember that these economic cycles aren't just these abstract phenomena. They have real human costs.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. In the first two parts of this episode, we've been really digging into the complexities of macroeconomic policies in developing countries, especially this whole idea of procyclical approaches and the challenges they bring. And, now I want to kind of explore a connection that you hit it at earlier, this link between these procyclical patterns and the concept of good governance.
Yeah, it's a really important connection. Good governance is fundamental to creating a policy environment that is stable, predictable. And as we talked about, that stability is really key to kind of reducing that inherent volatility and encouraging those countercyclical behaviors that can help to, smooth out those boom bust cycles.
So when we talk about good governance, in this context, what are the key elements? What does that look like in practice?
Well, transparency is a big one. Governments need to be open and accountable about how they're managing public finances. So this means publishing clear, accessible budget information, making it easy for citizens to understand how the money's being spent, and to hold public officials accountable for, any mismanagement or wrongdoing.
So no more hiding the books or making deals behind closed doors. It's about creating a system where everyone can see what's happening with the country's finances.
Exactly. And, transparency builds trust in the government. It helps to reduce the risk of corruption, which, as we know, can be a major driver of those pro-cyclical spending patterns as, people in power kind of seek to enrich themselves during those boom periods.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. What other elements kind of contribute to this idea of good governance?
Well, citizen participation is also crucial. People need to have a voice in how their country is being run. So, this could involve things like public consultations on budget priorities, maybe citizen oversight committees to, help monitor spending, even participatory budgeting processes where communities can have direct input on how funds are allocated.
So it's about moving beyond that top-down approach to economic policymaking and really creating a system where citizens are actively engaged in the process.
Precisely. When people feel like they have a real stake in the system, they're much more likely to support sound economic policies, even if those policies require, some short-term sacrifices for long-term stability.
That's a really good point. Building that kind of sense of ownership, that shared responsibility, can really make a big difference. Are there other key elements that we should be thinking about when it comes to this idea of good governance?
Well, the rule of law is essential. This means having a fair and impartial legal system that applies to everyone equally, including government officials. When the rule of law is weak, it just creates so much uncertainty, it undermines investor confidence, and it can really exacerbate that capital flight that we talked about earlier, during those economic downturns.
Right. So it's about creating a level playing field where everyone is held accountable to the same standards, no matter what their position or power is.
Precisely. And a strong rule of law, it protects property rights, enforces contracts, and it really helps to create a much more predictable and stable environment for businesses to operate in, which, in turn encourages investment and contributes to economic growth.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like all of these principles of good governance, they're all kind of interconnected and they reinforce each other. Are there any other, elements that are particularly important in this context?
One more that I think is really crucial is just effectiveness. Governments need to be able to deliver essential public services in a way that's, efficient and effective. So this means having competent, well-trained civil servants, investing in modern technology and infrastructure, and really streamlining a lot of those, cumbersome bureaucratic processes that often slow things down.
So it's not just about having, the right policies on paper. It's about making sure that the government can actually put those policies into practice in a way that actually delivers, benefits to the people.
Exactly. When governments are effective, efficient in their operations, they're just much better equipped to manage those economic shocks, provide those essential safety nets, and invest in those, long-term initiatives that really drive sustainable growth. And this all directly contributes to, reducing that pro-cyclicality of macroeconomic policies.
Yeah, this is all really starting to come together. It's not just about economics in isolation. It's about creating this whole, holistic system of governance that really allows for those sound economic policies to flourish and, to deliver those real benefits.
You put it really well. Good governance is really that bedrock of sound economic management.
So bringing it back to, the challenges facing developing countries, are there specific actions they can take to improve their governance and break free from this pro-cyclical trap? What are some practical steps that they can start to implement?
Well, there are, lots of potential strategies out there, and what works best, is going to vary from country to country depending on, their specific context. But there are some general principles, I think, that apply across the board.
Okay. Yeah, what are some of the key things that these countries should be, focusing on?
One overarching principle is to focus on building institutions, not just relying on personalities. Too often, developing countries rely on, maybe a charismatic leader to kind of drive change, but then when that leader leaves office, those reforms that they implemented often falter.
So it's about creating systems that can outlast any individual leader and kind of embed those, good governance principles into the very fabric of how the country operates.
Exactly. This means establishing clear rules, procedures, investing in training and professional development for civil servants, creating mechanisms for accountability and oversight to make sure those, rules and procedures are actually being followed, even when that leadership changes.
That sounds like a long-term process, but, a really essential one if you want to see that kind of, lasting progress. Are there any other key principles that you would kind of highlight?
Yeah, embracing decentralization is also a really important step. In a lot of developing countries, power is very concentrated in the hands of a small elite. And as we've talked about, that can lead to, corruption, inefficiency. By devolving power to, local governments, local communities, you can increase participation, improve service delivery, and you can reduce that risk of those procyclical spending patterns that are often driven by, by those at the top.
So it's about spreading the power more broadly, making sure that more people have a voice in how decisions are being made and how those resources are allocated.
Exactly. It's not just about giving people a voice, it's about giving them the resources, the authority to make those decisions that, directly affect their lives and their communities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's about, empowering people to be those active participants in shaping their own destinies. Any other principles you'd like to add to the list?
One more that I'd emphasize is, just the importance of learning from others. No country has all the answers. And, developing countries can benefit so much from sharing experiences and best practices with each other. There are so many examples out there of countries that have successfully, implemented countercyclical policies that have improved the governance structures. And by studying those examples and adapting them to their own context, developing countries can really accelerate their own progress.
Yeah, that's a great point. It really highlights the importance of, international cooperation, knowledge sharing. We can achieve so much more by working together and learning from each other's, successes and failures.
Absolutely. We're all interconnected. The challenges that are facing developing countries ultimately impact us all. And, by working together, by sharing knowledge, by supporting each other, we can really work towards, a more stable, just, and prosperous world for everyone.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I really gained a much deeper understanding of how these macroeconomic policies, economic shocks, and good governance, how they're all intertwined, especially, in the context of developing countries.
It's been a pleasure kind of exploring these complex issues with you today. And, I hope that the listeners have also found this deep dive to be informative and, hopefully even a little bit thought-provoking.
I'm sure they have. So as we kind of wrap up this final part of our conversation, what's the one key message you'd like our listeners to take away from this whole deep dive?
Well, I'd like to leave them with a sense of, hope and possibility. While the challenges facing developing countries are definitely significant, they're not insurmountable. By embracing those sound economic principles, by building those strong and transparent institutions, and by really cultivating that culture of good governance, these countries can, they can create a much brighter future for themselves and really inspire progress, across the globe. It's a journey that's worth taking. And the potential rewards are, they're really immense.
That's a really powerful and inspiring message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another, fascinating exploration of the world around us. But until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and, keep striving to make a positive impact out there.